a fundamental thing that you are allowed to do. And so yeah, again, it makes me absolutely furious, and it's just completely like, you know, that would be the one like thing you can't do. Like there's no possible way for clemency. If you ship a hardware platform that people aren't allowed to develop for, then you can't. There's literally no defense for it in court, right? In the court of Muratori, you are just permanently sentenced to death, and you're gone, right? We never hear from again. Everything else, there's plenty of, you know, there's plenty of mercy for you. We were happy to hear your explanation for why you did it. We will try to rehabilitate you as a person. We will you know, look upon you with understanding. But if you ship a hardware platform that you don't allow people to program for, due to your sort of like your avarice and greed or whatever it is, then that sorry, there are no defenses for it, and then we're gonna grind you up for sausage to feed hungry people. All right. Looks like we are done with the cues. I'm gonna close it down. Yes. And yes, there we go. Well, thank you everyone for joining for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. We're not quite finished with the thing that we want to do today, so we'll pick that up again tomorrow, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Hope to see you all here. And I'm looking forward to wrapping up the debug system too. I hope it's good in the end. I think we kind of went through a number. Like I said, it's actually one of the most serious architectural things we've done so far. And I feel like it's kind of important to sort of look back at it and understand how we went through each individual part of the process and how to push through it. So I hope it ends up being pretty good in the end. And I'm happy with sort of how we came through everything and eventually worked towards what I think is a fairly good solution that'll solidify. But we need a few more days to actually see it through to completion. And so that'll be what we're doing. And hopefully, maybe we can get it done in time for Handmade Con. So after Handmade Con, that'll be like our breaking point where we'll go to whatever our next thing is. Maybe some lighting. Who knows what we'll do. Actually, maybe there's a different thing we might do. But yeah, eventually we'll have to do lighting either way. So anyway, hope to join me for that tomorrow. Back here again, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you want to follow along with the source code at home, as always, handmadehero.org. You can pre-order the game. It comes with the source code so you can play around with it and learn from it. We also have a forum site where you can discuss the code, or if you're having problems, you can ask people for help, that sort of thing. We also have an annotated episode guide up there, which we'll probably start linking to. It's been going through some revisions and stuff, but we'll probably start linking to that pretty soon here on the main page, but we haven't quite gotten there yet, so it's linked to on the forums page. We also have a Patreon page if you want to support the video series, and a tweet bot that tells you what the schedule is if you want to catch the show live. That is the place to go for that. We also have our convention coming up. You can get tickets here. It's December 5th. Like I said, I think there's about 20 tickets left, something like that. Handmadecon.org has the information on it, and you can get the tickets right here. So that's going to be pretty awesome, Handmade Con is. I also should mention, as kind of a last note, I am probably going to be wanting, if you are somebody out there who has a camera that could record video of Handmade Con, like a good camera. Like if you're one of those people who has like a, you know, a 5D Mark II Canon camera or something with a decent lens on it, like something, if you're a high-end camera guy and you are coming to Handmade Con, if you have any interest in setting up a camera to record Handmade Con, I will be setting up some recording stuff myself, but I feel like if we got multiple cameras, more than just one, to record it, that would be good, because we never know, one could die in the middle of it, or we might want multiple angles. to sort of cut together after the fact to make sort of a better video of the thing. All kinds of stuff like that I think we could do. So I would be interested in hearing from people. You can post on the forums or send me an email, of course. My email address is public. You can just go on my Twitter handle, in fact, if you want to get it. Or you can actually just use on this page if you go to the About page, or you can actually see, I think on here, do we have this? Do we have this? Yeah, you can see me right here on the if you click on Case Inventory and go down to the bottom, you've got my kind of my contact info stuff. So if you are somebody who wants to help out with that, please let me know, because I think having more cameras is going to be better than having less cameras. And so if you're somebody who knows what they're doing with in terms of recording video, I would love to have your help keeping some redundant records of Handmade Con, just in case something goes wrong with the main ones that we're going to set up. That is about it. Until tomorrow. Start recording. Hello everyone, and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream, occasionally after eating way too many of the little candy egg things that I was eating on the pre-stream. It is true that I tend to eat those to excess. That is why it's pretty good that they're only available in the United States during Christmas and Easter. They used to only be available during Easter. Now they're available during both Christmas and Easter. And as a result, that means I get twice as fat as I used to get. But what are you going to do? That's just the reality of the situation. And after all, this is America, where we are very fat and unhealthy. So I feel like at the end of the day, I'm just doing my part to maintain our high average rate as a country. That said, today on Handmade Hero, we're going to go ahead and finish our memory handling for our debug code, which we pretty much got into the position of almost finishing yesterday. We did the first part of it, but yesterday I talked a bunch about stuff, and so we didn't have that much programming time. So today I want to go ahead and finish that up, and then we can sort of move on to cleaning up the UI for our debug stuff as well. Because then I think we just have our debug system running fairly cleanly at that point behind the scenes, and so we just have to start cleaning up the actual way it's displayed. Also, Martin's Mosaico, I don't know how to pronounce his name, I have never known, but you may know him as the person who answers like literally all of your questions on the Handmade Hero forums. He also pointed out that the version of Visual Studio that we're using, which is Visual Studio 2013, I guess, doesn't actually create thread-safe code for static variables. 2015 does, but 2013 does not. And so we also have to decide what we may want to do about that, because we did want to use static variables. We don't use static variables in any of our actual game code, but we do use it in the debug code to try and avoid doing lookups all the time. And so that code is something that we may have to consider as well. That's a sort of a separate issue that we may want to look at. As just in terms of how things work. Now, we may not care, because at the end of the day, it's just the debug code. So if we have some kind of a weird race condition where a debug variable gets added twice or something like this happens, we may just decide that that's not really that big of a deal and we don't care. But we should at least make the decision that we don't care. We shouldn't just sort of let it languish. So that's also something we should probably take a look at some point. Now, I will remind you today is day 217. So if you are following along at home and you are someone who has pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org and you want to follow along the source code, Day 216 source code, that is the source code that you want to be following along with today. Now, if I remember correctly, where we left off yesterday was just that we will hit our assertion about not being able was left off today. Now, if I Day 216 on handmadehero.org are following along at point. Now, I will at some point. Now, I will remind you today is day 217, so if you are following along at home and you are someone who has pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org and you want to follow along the source code, day 216 source code, that is the source code that you want to be following along with today. Now, if I remember correctly, where we left off yesterday was just that we will hit our assertion about not being able to actually do any of the freeing of the memory that we wanted to do. And so you can see the game kind of running here. It starts to fill up the debug buffer. The debug buffer gets filled, and then we get our assertion fires right here. when it actually tries to go get the memory. So for those of you who may have forgotten what was supposed to be happening here, what's going on is just as the debug buffer fills up, when it tries to, the first time it tries to allocate memory, that would overflow that debug buffer. So it goes to the debug buffer, goes, I need this much memory, and the debug buffer doesn't have that much memory in it. At that point, then what happens is we try to free stuff. And so this is our little routine here that was supposed to free variable groups. It does not currently free variable groups, it just asserts, and that is why our assert fired, right? So let's go ahead and push through that. So here's our free variable. Let's go ahead, right? So let's, right? Fired, right? So let's go ahead and push through that. So here's our free variable group situation. Oops, not in that file. Here's our free variable group. And if we take a look at how debug variable group actually is implemented, and if we situation, oops, not in that file. Here's our free variable group. And if we take a look at how debug variable group actually is implemented, we should be able to see fairly immediately how that is supposed to occur. Now, like I said, it's a little bit janky. I'm a little bit torn. I kind of feel like maybe we want to just actually kind of rewrite a little bit of this stuff, or rather clean this stuff up a little bit as we do it, instead of writing the free, then changing it, and then rewriting the free, basically. Because what I was saying yesterday is that really these debug variable groups, that part of it, is really a standing structure, and it's really the debug events themselves that are the part that needs to get freed over time, right? And so really that part of it is kind of why I was sort of saying, I think maybe we want to sort of do that part, because free variable group honestly isn't something that's ever really probably going to happen. Free variable group is not it. It's going to be freeing these debug event pieces of information is really what's actually going to be getting freed at the end of the day. So I'm just trying to think about how exactly we want to do that, how we want to sort of move towards that kind of a structure for things. And so I don't know. So maybe, what we'll do is just do that part of it first. We'll jump ahead a little bit and then jump back instead of kind of finishing this up, which is what I was kind of thinking. Now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, probably we don't really want to do that. We want to finish this part up first and then finish the other part up. All right, so what I was saying before, you remember this was kind of a little bit, I'm going to call it an epiphany because it was just working through an architectural problem in the way that you do. But the realization was that linking, sort of considering the structure of things to be baked into the frame was stupid. What we actually want is the structure of things to be a persistent concept that's built up and understood globally in the debug system. And then on any given frame, we just have the data for the values that those things took on at that time, right? That's what we actually want to have happen. And so that's what we're trying to make work here. And so that means really this stuff is all totally fine. And it's really just this part that has to change. And then the main difference is just going to be that in here, when we had debug frame, right? And in here we've kind of have this debug frame thing. Instead of the root grouping in here, it's really just a question of kind of pull root grouping in here. It's really root grouping in here. It's really just a question of kind of pulling back a little bit and putting it back in the debug state, which is actually where it used to be, right? Just putting it back in there and going, all right, this root group that we had in here before, in fact, you can still see the variable was still there, right? Even though I don't think it's actually necessarily being used for anything at the moment. If we just make the root group exist in there permanently, then that takes care of the hierarchy part of things, and we never actually free the hierarchy. The hierarchy just grows to the point where it contains all the possible debug points that exist in the program, which is not that many, right? It's a finite number of them that are just existing, in the code where we've said, please give us some debug coverage here. And after we do that, right? Then what we want to do is have some way, so we've got that debug hierarchy. What we want to do is have some way of having these debug events sort of stack up in one of those, right? So if we have, we almost have like sort of this this concept, like I said, of a debug element. which is really just like, okay, I've got some number of events in here, and like I said, we almost stack up in one of those, right? So if we have these debug events, so we've got, right? Then what we want to do is have some way, so we've got that debug hierarchy. What we want to do is have some way of having these debug events sort of stack up in one of those, right? So if we have, we almost have like sort of this this concept, like I said, of a debug element, which is really just like, okay, I've got some number of events in here, and like I said, I don't really know exactly how we want this to work per se, but just if you imagine the simplest possible thing, you could imagine us literally just chaining these events together and then sort of pulling them out as we start to free things. We'd pull them out. That's the simplest possible thing. You could also imagine keeping arrays here. I'm not sure what the best way to do that is. I'm not sure which is the way that we want to do it. But we do know what we actually want to have happen. So what we want to have happen is when we go to free memory, so let's say we have one of these debug variable links here, right? And that's the standing structure that contains the UI. It's so these are like the sort of the UI pieces that are floating around that are viewing things or doing whatever else, right? You can imagine that we're saying, okay, it's viewing some element, and an element has some number of events in it that all belong to this element, right? Or whatever the data is that needs to be in here, right? So you can take one of those debug events or something, and you can imagine, let's say that we were just doing a more hard-coded kind of a system, right? One that wasn't designed to be flexible or anything like that. You can imagine something like this where you're just like, oh, and we could even just hard code it. You say like, oh, there's 8 events per debug element, and they just kind of come in and then they fall out when they fall out, or whatever, right? You can imagine something like that being the hard-coded way. But if we want these things to just sort of stack up until we run out of memory, then my question is just, okay, it's easy to have them stack up because as the events come in and we collate them, we find the debug element to which they correspond and we stick them in there, right? That's pretty easy to do, but what we don't know is when we need to reclaim memory, what event do we free? See what I'm saying? That's the part that's not immediately clear. And so you can imagine these being double-threaded. I don't know, how that sounds kind of crazy. I'm not sure that's really something we would want to do. But you can imagine, like, okay, we're going to free a frame. We need to kind of go through all the debug elements that exist. And we need, for every debug element, we need to free, like, one event off of them, right? So if we take a look in the actual debug interface, right? So if we take a look in the actual debug interface where we have the debug event here, you can kind of see that this at the moment doesn't have any room for anything in it really extra, right? Because these are going into the log and we don't want to bloat that out at all. So really what we would have here is we'd have like a debug, a debug stored event or something like that. And we would put debug events in here, and then we would, point to the next one or whatever. Something like this. You know what I'm saying? And this right here would probably have something where we would go, oh, you know what? There's a debug stored event, and it's the first event or something like that, right? And, like I said, you can imagine, I don't know how we want to do this exactly, but I'm just saying this is the simplest thing that would capture what we actually need it to do. Like what we actually need to have occur is this. So in here, we would just say, okay, and this would probably be, again, just something that we would chain very simply. And so if we want to do something like this, we would have these debug elements. The debug elements would store basically just a chain of events. And any one of the UI systems in the thing could point to one of those and be displaying it, basically, right? So if we were to do that, then what we would need is some way of walking all of the debug elements that exist and pulling, again, the first thing off of their debug event chain every time we wanted to sort of like free store basically just a chain of events. Have these debug elements. The debug elements would store basically just a chain of events. and any one of the UI systems in the thing can point to one of those and be displaying it, basically, right? So if we were to do that, then what we would need is some way of walking all of the debug elements that exist. If we were to do that, then what we would need is some way of walking all of the debug elements that exist and pulling, again, the first thing off of their debug event chain every time we wanted to sort of like free memory. We just kind of go through there and yank, you know, some guys and toss them and free them. So that would be relatively easy for us to do. Again, there's a little bit of sort of oddity there because if you imagine that it's not true that on every frame that we would actually have debug events for every element that exists. And so we also don't really know which frame we're talking about. So it's almost like, too, you would also want something like this, right? Where every time we free a frame, we go through and we look through the events that we have, and we're only going to free frames that match that frame index, right? And if the frame index that we see is actually greater than the frame index that we're trying, where we're trying to make the cutoff, then we don't free it. So that's, again, not saying this is anything particularly brilliant. I'm not saying this is really necessarily a good idea. I'm just trying to figure out like what would sort of roughly accomplish the thing that we would need to accomplish. And it seems like we would need something like that. Okay, so if we push forward on that a little bit, then what we would need to do, again, is we need to have this, storing these things is pretty straightforward, but what is less straightforward, potentially, is how we iterate over them when we need to free them. And I suppose the way we could do that is we could just use the root group and iterate over it like walking it like a hierarchy, just sort of the standard way that we would iterate over anything else. And in fact, we've kind of already have a way to iterate over it, right? Where is that code? We've got that in here somewhere. Yeah. So in here where we've got this kind of like iteration code like so, that's an example of what we could do. We could iterate over everything and do the freeing as part of that iteration pass, right? As part of the sweep through what we were doing, we could do that, right? It's just a thought. That's just one way we could do it. One thing I do not actually remember about our code is why we were actually doing it. I don't remember why we were saying like, oh, we shouldn't do it with recursion. There was something where it's like, oh, we'll write it without recursion, maybe just to write it without, I don't even remember. There's some weirdness going on there, so we may also want to make this a little less obtuse while we're at it. Because I think I was just like out to lunch that day. In fact, I even think I said I felt like I was out to lunch that day. But that's a separate issue. Anyway, so yeah, if we want to do that, that's really all we would need is some way to kind of get through here. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot and just see kind of what comes out of it, right? So if you take a look at what's going on here, if we have this, like, I don't really remember, again, which of these, because we kind of sort of gutted a bunch of that stuff. I don't necessarily remember which ones of these were doing what or why or when or how or anything like that. So what we would need to do is first, for every frame that we might have, we're going to need some kind of an index for that frame, right? So we're going to have to take these debug frames and we're going to presumably keep all this stuff. I don't really want the region stuff anymore because, so let's get rid of that as well. We'll sort of cut that part out. But we need something here that's like the frame index. This is like the canonical frame index. And that's, again, the thing that in here would tell us which one we're sort of doing there. And then when we create a new frame, right, when we create one of these, and we set like stuff like the begin clock value and stuff like that. So here we are, a new frame, right? Then what we need to do every time we do a new frame is we need to actually create inside there a frame index that's canonical. So we need to do like debug state frame, like total frame count or something like that. And so then here, where we've got the frame count, which is probably going to be something more like how many frames are in here or whatever, we've got a total frame count. And to be honest, I don't even know if that's actually necessary anymore. But we've got a total frame count, which is going to be a number that just increments as we run the game. Now, normally, that would mean that we'd have a limit of 4 billion frames, right? Because otherwise, and then it will wrap around. And if you think about, right? So then here, where we frame, like total frame count or something like that. And so then state create. Then what we need to do every time we are a new frame, right? Then what we need to do every time we do a new frame is we need to actually create inside there a frame index that's canonical. So we need to do like debug state frame, like total frame count or something like that. And so then here, where we've got the frame count, which is probably going to be something more like how many frames are in here or whatever, we've got a total frame count. And to be honest, I don't even know if that's frame count or something like that. And so then here, where we've got the frame count, which is probably frame count or something like that. And so then here, where we've got the frame count, which is probably going to be something more like how many frames are in here or whatever, we've got a total frame count. And to be honest, I don't even know if that's actually necessary anymore. But we've got a total frame count, which is going to be a number that just increments as we run the game. Now, normally, that would mean that we'd have a limit of 4 billion frames, right? Because otherwise, and then it will wrap around. And if you think about what that implies in terms of, well, I guess I can use our Emacs calc here. I always forget. If you think about what that means, if you were to say, okay, we've got 4 times 1024 times 1024 times 1024, right? And that's how many frames. That unsigned integer will go from 0 to 4 billion, right? As that goes up, how many frames is that? Well, if we were doing 60 frames a second, right? Then that's how many seconds it would be, if that makes sense. And so if that's how many seconds, and then we want to know like how many minutes, that would be like another 60 seconds, right? It's 60 frames per second, and then it's 60 seconds in a minute, right? And then we've got 60 minutes in an hour, and then like 24 hours in a day or something like this, right? Did I get that right? I don't know why that just so that would run for like what, 2 years? Is that correct? Let's double check. How many seconds in a day? Right? Seconds in a day. Did it do it? Did it do it? So basically, we've got this times 60 frames per second, and so that's how many actual frames we would go through in one day, right? And so if we wanted to know when we would wrap, this is the calculation. That's how many frames we can count versus how many frames in a day. That's how many days. So yeah, we did it right. 828. So, realistically, is anyone going to be capturing debug info for 2.5 years or whatever that is? No. So we don't really have to worry about this wrapping, so I think we're totally fine there. And so then every time we do a new frame, so I think we're, or whatever that is? No. So we don't really have to worry about this wrapping, so I think we're totally fine there. And so then every time we do a new frame, all we have to do is just assign a new index to it, and those indices will sort of just grow over time monotonically, right? I'm going to go ahead and nuke the region index stuff here. Just go ahead and I'll just get rid of it temporarily. And then we can start to focus on this other part of the debug code that we need to fix, which again is that sort of concept of where does this stuff go as we sort of pull it out of the debug string. Just go ahead and over time monotonically, right? I'm going to go ahead and nuke the region index stuff here. Just go ahead and I'll just get rid of it temporarily. And then we can start to focus on this, get rid of it, the region index stuff here. Just grow over time monotonically, right? I'm going to go ahead and nuke the region index stuff here. Just go ahead and I'll just get rid of it temporarily. And then we can start to focus on this other part of the debug code that we need to fix, which again is that sort of concept of where does this stuff go as we sort of pull it out of the debug stream and put it into something. We need to put it into these like debug stored events, so let's make that actually happen. So, okay. Looks like this is just capturing, yeah, so what's happening here is this is that var link interaction. This is just if you were trying to interact with one of the debug values, right? Then what you were doing is you're passing one of these links, and before the link pointed directly to the event that it was interacting with, now it's not going to anymore. You're going to have to kind of come down to an element and so on. And what's interesting about this is probably, I would also say, inside the debug element, we'd probably want to know like the first and last of the series. Because this is like the most recent and this is like the oldest, right? So it's actually like the oldest event and the most recent event, right? And each one of those, you know, we kind of have those sort of chained over time, like I said. So yeah, so if you want to interact with one of those guys, then you're in a situation where you have to have something, again, where you're going to have to sort of grab this out of here. So this would, a var link interaction would have to be something where I guess, you know, we would look here and say if there is an actual event present in the thing, then you can do it, because otherwise you couldn't do it. Like there might be no events at all in whatever this particular thing is that you're trying to interact with, and that would make it so that you can't interact with it, right? So presumably you have something like this where you're like, okay, whatever the links element is, it's got a most recent event. Whatever that is, that's the one you would presumably be interacting with, right? And on here you'd say like, okay, because again, if you're interacting with something, it's a little dicey too, because now that I think about it, there's additional things you might even want to do here, which are even more complicated than this, which is like if you're trying to interact with a particular frame index, then this would want to sort of look through that linked list and say, do we have one for this particular frame, right? Which is even more kind of crazy if you think about it. So yeah, so I don't know. It also even maybe sort of suggests to me, like as I kind of think about it in my head, like do you want to just be throwing all these things into sort of a hash somewhere, where you're just kind of like dumping events into the hash and then, you know, they come in or come out or whatever, like something like this. I don't know. Again, that's something that to be thought of if we ever want to optimize the debug system, which, you know, probably we maybe never would even do. So anyway, if we have something like this, then we can interact with the event that way. We can just say, all right, you know, we'll go out and grab it. Yeah, and that's, I think, mostly all we would really be talking about. So in here, when we're grabbing events out, I think the same thing is true, right? For events, I don't know how the events get used in here, or if they get used, exactly how they occur. So yeah, there's the like event type stuff that we're switching off of. So really what we would want to do here is check to make sure that the event actually exists, right? I think we would want to do something like this. Oops. And then we would kind of come through here and bracket around that. So assuming that the event actually exists, that way we can do, again, the same thing. And you know what I'll do, since people are going to be pulling this out, I'm going to make an actual utility function out of that so that we can maybe potentially make it do different things in the future as well. So if we just said, okay, there's this concept that you can get the debug event pointer back from a particular link. So you can be like get event from link or something. And I don't mean link like the character in Legend of Zelda, right? So anyway, here's the debug variable link, and it's going to just be this. So exactly the same thing that I was doing. Here's result. So the result equals this guy. And then we return him. So that way, if in the future we do want to do something where it looks at like some active frame selection sort of a situation, or I don't really know what we want to do, but that would give us maybe a way of going like when we just want to know whatever the like current thing to print is. We know it's going through get event from link, so we can do some kind of fancy jazz in there if we need to. All right. So that also means this can go away, doesn't have to check anymore. It can just sort of do its thing where it's like, oh yeah, get it from that, and everyone's happy and smiling, and it's just great, and everyone loves it, and it's fantastic, and it's just the best thing ever, and that's great. Okay, so that's all good. Oops, except I didn't put in the right name for it. And so here is our debug event. Like I said, this is just like get event from link, and then we can just do that, and we're good. Function does not take argument. That's true. It takes the debug state as well. So all of these varlink interactions are presumably going to be that way. So they've got to take the debug state now as well. There we go. Region count. So add region is just going to be zeroed out for now, because I don't even know that we're going to have that anymore. All right, so we've got events. So when we do add variable to group, here's the debug event, and we're adding that debug event. So this thing, you know, again, this is not actually correct anymore, because this thing that's building up variable groups, those are actually going to be permanent things now. And so what we actually need is when we're building up those hierarchies, we now need a way of like sort of permanently placing things in a debug hierarchy, because that hierarchy is going to exist essentially forever. So when we say add variable to group, and again, like the other thing that's a little bit weird about that is we have the choice, and I don't know what we want to necessarily do about it, but when you think about what's going to go on here, there's two kinds of hierarchies as well that we might talk about. There's the hierarchy of the data coming in from the debug system. And, you know, maybe we don't even necessarily consider that exactly a hierarchy anyways. It's just we have a certain set of possible debug locations, right? We've got those. And then we also have, you know, some sort of a hierarchy for the UI. And that hierarchy is more fluid and implies a bunch of different stuff because the user maybe wants to drag things around and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure exactly, again, how we want to handle that stuff. It's kind of a little bit odd. And it's, again, we sort of had, we had the ability to deal with this stuff before by using the counter variables. Now we don't have those anymore, but we're synthetically creating those. Remember, we inside debug interface. What we did there is we just did a like, where is it? No, it's not that. It is, where's the code? It's not atomic add U64. It's not global events rate index. No, it's none of these things. Yeah, so there's supposed to be, I thought we did a thing where this calls into the debug system and says, hey, I want you to allocate a new one. We had like a static, we had like static variables and all that stuff. Yeah, here it is. Here it is. I was like, this is the whole thing where I was talking about at the beginning. Yeah, this is the stuff that I'm talking about. So in here, when we have the sort of static values that have to get initialized and all that kind of nonsense, this whole thing here, debug initialize value, where we have sort of this recording of a thing that we record once and then we get back, I guess, a permanent pointer to it, that sort of thing. So what exactly, I just want to refresh my memory as to what we're getting back with that so I can plan out how these things would work. Let's see here. So when we do one of these, we do a record debug event with debug type mark debug value, and then we don't actually do anything with that. What? Wait. What? What? Hold on a second. Record debug event. What's going on here? So it just gets one of these events back, but how does that help? How does that help anybody? We get back one from the global. We just get what, you know, this is just getting back, all this is doing, right, is getting back a entry into the debug event table. So how does that help us with our static initialization of these guys here? What is that actually? Oh, we pass it forwards. Well then. All right, so you can see what happens here, right? So essentially we don't actually know in the debug system. We do a local persist here, and that local persist is the debug event that gets passed into the debug system. The debug system records the fact that there is a debug event now sitting on the stack of this, you know, of the caller. And that is, well, it's not the stack of caller because it's a static variable, so it's actually in the heap. But point being, the caller's scope has that in there, and we use that as the permanent location of this thing. So the reason that that's kind of a little disappointing is because, again, it means that we don't have any kind of a real table entry or anything in particular for the, you know, we don't have anything that we build up in here that's already correspondent. We would have to do something like use the address of that variable, you know, or who knows what exactly. And so, yeah, I'm not 100% certain how I feel about that, but I suppose just a hash table that hashed on that location wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for any particular reason. I mean, I can't think of anything, at least, is I guess what I would say. And at some level, I also do think that if all we really need is an ID that's unique, if we were just going to always use like a hash table or something like that, then having a static variable, well then. All right. So how does, so it just, hold on. What, wait, don't, with debug, I just want to refresh that sort of thing, of a thing that we record once and then we get back, where we have this whole thing here, static values that have to get initialized and all that kind of nonsense. Have the, yes, we add like static, I want this, I thought we did a thing where the thing we, I thought we did a thing where this calls into the debug system and says, hey, I want you to allocate a new one. We had like a static, we had like static variables and all that stuff. Yeah, here it is. Here it is. I was like, this is the whole thing where I was talking about at the beginning. Yeah, this is the stuff that I'm talking about. So in here, when we have the sort of static values that have to get initialized and all that kind of nonsense, this whole thing here, debug initialize value, where we have sort of this recording of a thing that we record once and then we get back, I guess, is getting back a entry. So what exactly, I just want to refresh my memory as to what we're getting back with that so I can plan out how these things would work. Let's see here. So when we do one of these, we do a record debug event with debug type mark debug value, and then we don't actually do anything with that. What? Wait. What? What? Hold on a second. Record debug event. What's going on here? So it just gets one of these events back, but how does that help? How does that help anybody? We get back one from the global. We just get what, this is just getting back. All this is doing, right? How does that help? One of these events back, but how does that help? How does that help anybody? We get back one from the global. We just get what, this is just getting back. All this is doing, right, is getting back a entry into the debug event table. So how does that help us with our static initialization of these guys here? What is that actually? Oh, we pass it forwards. Well then. All right, so you can see what happens here, right? So essentially we don't actually know in the debug system. We do a local persist here, and that local persist is the debug event that gets passed into the debug system. The debug system records the fact that there is a debug event now sitting on the stack of this, of the caller. And that is, well, it's not the stack of caller because it's a static variable, so it's actually in the heap. But point being, the caller's scope has that in there, and we use that as the permanent location of this thing. So the reason that that's kind of a little disappointing is because, again, it means that we don't have any kind of a real table entry or anything in particular for the, we don't have anything that we build up in here that's already correspondent. We would have to do something like use the address of that variable, or who knows what exactly. And so, yeah, I'm not 100% certain how I feel about that, but I suppose just a hash table that hashed on that location wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for any particular reason. I mean, I can't think of anything, at least, is I guess what I would say. And at some level, I also do think that if all we really need is an ID that's unique, if we were just going to always use like a hash table or something like that, then having a static variable might actually be all we need. So riddle me this, Batman. Here's what I'm thinking. So what I want out here, right, is I want to be able to do something. In fact, if we look at what we had here, we've got these debug stored elements, or whatever, these debug elements or whatever they are, right? And we've got this sort of stuff with the tree that's like how we might display it in the UI, but then we actually have the values that we're going to store, and those are in here. And so we need some way of, like, as we see things, we need a way of like corresponding them out to these debug elements, right? And you can imagine if we just had a big old thing of these debug elements, cure whatever, whatever we want to do there. If we just had a big old thing of these debug elements, we need to then be able to find the debug element that corresponds to something. And before we were using counters for that, so that we could know exactly which one we were talking about. But we kind of were saying that that's maybe not the best thing in the world to do because that forces that whole weird thing with the translation units needing to be defined. And it sort of was adding all this complexity, and we didn't really want to have to deal with it. And so what I'm thinking is like, okay, if we did have some kind of just a hash table sort of a situation where we looked up things in the hash table, I feel like what we could do is use the static variable's address, right? We could use the address of this guy as the thing that would tell us a unique ID. So basically it gives us sort of the equivalent of counter in that they're unique, but it's not quite as good as counter because they're not like linearly laid out in a perfect array fashion, which is what we would, prefer to have if we could. Since we can't have that, it would give us, it would effectively give us what we wanted, right? We could also do something a little bit more we could use sort of a thing that increments a variable as well to get a linearized version. Ooh, just like yesterday, right on schedule. I'm still so jet lagged. I've been going to bed at like 8:30 at night, so it's like, I get off Handmade Hero and there's like an hour or two before I'm just asleep. So anyway, looking at this, I'm just trying to think of like what the right way is to correspond out to those debug elements, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, what the best way to do that would be. And hash table seems like maybe it's as good as anything else for that. Seems like a fair thing. And we could probably, we've already got the concept of hashing these things in the view hash. I guess but that's dependent on the piece of UI that we're talking about. So that probably wouldn't really help us out much. So we would need a different hash, which is again kind of annoying, but I don't know. It seems reasonable. It seems like a reasonable way to get at those things. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about it one way or the other, to be honest with you. Do you guys have a strong opinion about it? I don't know how you're feeling about it. I think I'm just going to say like, okay, maybe we just do have a hash. I think I'm just going to say like, okay, maybe we just do have a hash. So we've got something like, here's the element hash or whatever, and we just we stick stuff in there as we go, something like that. It's in theory, it's plausible. I could believe it. I could believe it. So at that point, we also have this sort of values group, root group thing. These are UI things, right? And in fact, I think these would probably go away to some degree, and we would just have a tree, a particular debug tree that we considered to be the tree that we that we build up initially. That like is the root UI tree, something like this. So we wouldn't necessarily have these. I don't know if values group is used anymore. I suspect it's probably not, but I'll double check. Let's see here. Values group. Yeah, so values group is just the sort of thing we were using for our sort of debug hacky, like show the values there. Is root group getting used other than in the frame as well? Would be the other question I have. So root group, create variable in the frame. Not really either, so it's only being used in there. So yeah, so I feel like that's the transformation that we want to make. I feel like that's the transformation we want to make. So we'd have something that looks like this, right? We have the view hash. I feel like that's the transformation that we want to make. I feel like that's the transformation we want to make. So we'd have something that looks like this, right? We have the view hash, which is basically the thing that stores how the UI itself wants to sort of view things, like what the status of things is in the UI. We have the debug element hash, which basically says for anything that we're getting data about, we have a place where we dump sort of its state over time, which is fine. And yeah, and that seems maybe like it's reasonable enough for now. I don't know. So let's see. If I want to do that, right, and I guess the other thing too is then, like I said, we have these sort of debug UI trees, and the debug UI trees could be whatever the user wants to build, as the user is like kind of making stuff that they might want to use to view things or whatever else they're doing, who knows. You could imagine them doing this. So as the user is like doing that process, they're creating trees, but we would also presumably have one canonical tree that would work sort of as the as this stuff goes, right? So we've got ground chunks underscore checkerboards, and that was, we were sort of saying we wanted that to mean like, okay, there's a ground chunks, like there's a hierarchical item ground chunks, and then underneath the hierarchical element ground chunks, there's an entry checkerboards, and that's a Boolean that you can switch on and off, right? So if you imagine that being a thing, then that thing needs to exist somewhere as sort of a canonical UI that you can play with, right? A UI that you're not editing, that you can't screw around with potentially, that's sort of just the canonical one that gets built up. And so what that suggests to me too is like, okay, there's a tree sentinel or whatever that has like debug trees in it, but then we probably also have a debug tree that's sort of a separate one, which is just like the root tree, or I don't know, something like that. Where we would have this one tree where as things come in, when we see a new thing, have these sort of debug UI trees, and the debug UI trees could be whatever the user wants to build, as the user is, you could imagine them doing this. So as the user is like doing that process, they're creating trees, but of things is in the UI. We have the debug element hash, which basically values group is used anymore. I suspect it's probably not, but I'll double check. Let's see here. We build up. We have, I could believe it. So at that point, we also have this sort of values group root group thing. These are UI things, right? And in fact, I think these would probably go away to some degree. And we would just have a tree, a particular debug tree, things one that gets built up. And so what that suggests to me too is like, okay, there's a tree, so what that gets built up. And so what that suggests to me too is like, okay, there's a tree sentinel or whatever that has like debug trees in it, but then we probably also have a debug tree that's sort of a separate one, which is just like the root tree, or I don't know, something like that. Where we would have this one tree where as things come in, and so what that suggests to me too is like, okay, there's a tree sentinel or whatever that has like debug trees in it, but then we probably also have a debug tree that's sort of a separate one, which is just like the root tree, or I don't know, something like that. Where we would have this one tree where as things come in, when we see a new thing, we find a place where it should go in the tree by doing the name matching as we go, and the thing gets stuck in there. So I feel like we would also need that, because in addition to the element hash, which is just the thing that actually stores the stuff that we have, we would also sort of have to have this concept of the tree, of the root tree, which is sort of the UI version of that. So the element hash. The weird thing about this too is the element hash, we probably don't want that hash to be particularly large, would be my guess as well. And the reason I say that is because I feel like the element hash is going to have to be iterated over all the time anyway. Because remember, anytime we want to free memory, we've got to go through that element hash, find some stuff in it that we're going to free, and free it. So we don't want to be stepping over a huge number of things. And since there's not going to be that many places in the code necessarily that have debug points in them, we're talking about, and some kind of a relatively small number. So when we do that looping over those variables to do the reclaiming of memory space, I feel like that's probably what we would want, is a relatively small number of things to loop over. Now, there's probably a smarter way, again, like I said, to look at this stuff, but again, I don't want to make the world's most optimized debug system. That can sort of be an exercise left for the reader of how you would sort of start to take these concepts and maybe turn the crank on them a little bit. because again, the end user will never run this code. So it's strictly like going to be there for our benefit, which means if it runs fast enough to be usable in a debugging scenario, then it's fast enough. So okay, so let's say we did something like that. Then what that would imply? Let's say we did something like. So okay, so let's say we did something like that. Then what that would imply is when we do free frame. Then what we would do is free variable group would not actually be what would happen, right? We would free the frame, but we would also then have a thing which would go through here, and it would just say like, okay, you know, for all in the debug state, for all of the entries in the hash table of the element hash, then for all of those, excuse me. For all of those things in the element hash, what we then want to do is we want to look at the chain as whatever that hash chain is, right? Because we've got sort of debug elements here. Oops. Debug element. So in here, where we've got these debug elements, and we've got these events, and then we presumably also have the debug element, like you know, next in hash or whatever, if they're in the hash. So in here, we would have to go, okay, for each debug element in the chain, right? So here's the element, debug state, element hash index. For each element in the chain, we want to take a look, and for all of the events that have been stored for this particular element, right? So for any event that got attributed to it, we know that we've got from oldest to most recent. We want to free any of them that are before the frame that we're trying to free now, right? So we're trying to free a particular frame, so anything with that frame index or earlier should be flushed. And so that's a pretty simple while loop, right? It's just going to say while the oldest event, whatever that is, has, I guess we should say, first of all, while there is an oldest event, and that oldest event's frame index is less than or equal to whatever our frame index is that we're freeing, we want to free it, right? So we would want to say, okay, this particular debug stored event, and you know what? We already wrote this code too. We wrote this here. We want to do a free list deallocate on these. Okay. So we come through and say like, all right, for everything in the element hash, if the oldest event, if there is an event in there, and its frame index is less, then we know that we want to take that guy, whatever the oldest event is. This is debug. What is it called? Debug stored event. So this is what we're going to free, right? And we want to then free it and update the pointers, right? So we want to say the element oldest event equals the free event next, and then we also want to say that the oldest event most recent. I'm sorry, the element most recent event, if that is equal to the event being freed. Then we know that, you know, it's also going to be that, but that actually means it should also be null, right? So this should always just be 0, but whatever. We could even assert that. We could do this. So assuming that we do that, then we want to deallocate it here. The free list pointer would be just in the debug state. We just have a pool of these guys that just gets recycled. So that would just be first free stored event. And this guy is just the element, the free event. That's what I meant, right? So that's it. That's how we would free a frame. So we basically free all of the elements in that frame that are all of the elements that exist currently, all of their stored events that would have been on or before that frame, they go away. And you know, we could be more specific and do that and just say, look, whatever. But I feel like I kind of want it to catch all, like, let's say we free a frame and then somehow we get an event that comes in late and gets added, you know, in there somehow. I feel like we want to do something where we just would make sure that, you know, eventually it would get cleaned up. It's probably not necessary, but it's just, I'm just kind of saying why not, right? And so while that's true, we just kind of loop through and we just pull off and free all of those, right? And that's all there is. So that would be how we would free a frame. There's also in here now we would have a debug stored event, first free stored event. And whenever we would, you know, after we would free a frame, whenever we would be calling debug records now, when we would sort of be putting these things into place, then we would sort of do this notion of taking a event off of the free list and using it for storage, right? So there you go. That's what that is. So now we need to, whenever we, and first, so in here now, so that would be how we would free a frame. There's also in here now we would free a frame. There's also in here now we would free a frame. There's also in here now we would have a debug. So that would be, and that's all there is. So that would be how we would free a frame. There's also in here now we would have a debug stored event, first free stored event. And whenever we would, you know, after we would free a frame, whenever we would be calling debug records now, when we would sort of be putting these things into place, then we would sort of do this notion of taking a event off of the free list and using it for storage, right? So there you go. That's what that is. So now we need to kind of like press forward a little bit and finish up the rest of this stuff. Oops. And so again, like I said, the question here is we sort of have these trees and things, and I'm wondering, is the tree, was there anything in particular, like why did we still need the tree? Can we get rid of the trees and just use variable groups for that? Is there anything, like does a tree do anything that we care about at all? Is it just because it stores like where it was? Is that like all we need it for? And I think it does appear that that's the case. So really, a debug tree like is almost nothing relevant anyway. So yeah. Anyway, let's go ahead and get rid of all this stuff. I'm just going to say that this stuff goes away entirely at the moment, and that's fine. And so let's go ahead and recompile this. So now we're talking about the stuff where we have to actually start to fix up the collation. And I feel like we got rid, right, of the handmade variable stuff, yeah, right, of debug variable. That stuff's all gone, right, yeah. Because then remember we previously had a file that had a bunch of other stuff in there. So we have this sort of like variable group stuff, and I think we rid, right, have to actually start and that's fine. And so let's go ahead and recompile this. So anyway, let's go ahead and get rid of all this stuff. I'm just going to say that this stuff goes away entirely at the moment, and that's fine. And so let's go ahead and recompile this. So now we're talking about the stuff where we have to actually start to fix up the collation. And I feel like we got rid, right, of the handmade variable stuff, yeah, right, of debug variable. That stuff's all gone, right, yeah. Because then remember we previously had a file that had a bunch of other stuff in there. So we have this sort of like variable group stuff, and I think we previously were calling them collate, and now we're not anymore, yeah. So all that stuff already got cleaned up, and that's good, but this stuff is still not really correct, right? Like this stuff is now kind of still doing it the old school way, which is not what we actually want it to do. So for example, when we do this thing that's called create variable here, what we actually want to be doing now is we want to be doing a thing where whenever we see something new, we're going to be placing it into this element hash based on some kind of information that we get about it, right? And so we want to do things here where we're, this whole situation is now not really correct, right? So let's take a look at where that's actually happening, because it should only be happening in one place, I believe. Now, if I'm not entirely mistaken, where does create variable actually occur? Okay, it never occurs. Is that what you're telling me? Shouldn't that have been okay? Because it just, all right, I take it back. Before, the reason that it never happens is because, right, we got rid of the concept that you ever actually create those things out of Vine. Okay, that's fine. That's one more thing we don't have to do, I guess. So anyway, what that means is now, all we have to do right here is this is where everything would happen. This is where an event comes in that's some kind of a type that just means we're seeing event that's data that we need. Event comes right here. So anyway, what do I guess? So anyway, what that means is now, all we have to do right here is this is where everything would happen. This is where an event comes in that's some kind of a type that just means we're seeing event that's data that we need stored, right? It's not something like this where we're seeing a begin block, end block. Although even this right here, instead of creating these regions, I think this probably is something, again, that we would want to create sort of those standing structures for. So that's actually something that I feel like we probably would want to have happen as well. So really, I think this code should probably, in here, instead of creating a region, like I said, get rid of that concept, that region concept entirely probably, and actually make that just be something that gets stored like everything else is being stored. So we have the begin block, end blocks all, again, go straight into that keyed element, the element hash, right? I'm actually starting to be pretty happy with this. I think this is going to come together really nicely. Takes a long time to get to the right thing, but I think this is starting to get the begin block, make that just be something that gets stored like everything else is being stored. So we have the begin block, end blocks all, again, go straight into that keyed element, the element hash, right? I'm actually starting to be pretty happy with this. I think this is going to come together really nicely. Takes a long time to get to the right thing, but I think this is starting to be like actually like a little bit more. This is starting to feel like it's arriving at a good place to me, and that's nice. It's like you can tell. I don't know. It's just I don't know if this is just like having worked on so many architectural problems in the past. You never know when you've arrived at like the perfect architecture necessarily, because you never know what you might be missing or what could be better. Like it's hard to always know like what the future could be. But there's definitely, at least from my experience, at this point, there's definitely a feeling that I get when I know I haven't gotten to the architecture that I should be doing. From could be what you might arrive. Just I don't know if this is starting to thing, but I think this is starting to look really nicely. Takes a long time to get to the right thing. I think I'm actually starting to be pretty happy with this. I think this is going to come together really nicely. Takes a long time to get to the right thing, but I think this is starting to be like actually like a little bit more. This is starting to feel like it's arriving at a good place to me, and that's nice. It's like you can tell. I don't know. It's just I don't know if this is just like having worked on so many architectural problems in the past. You never know when you've arrived at like the perfect architecture necessarily, because you never know what you might be missing or what could be better. Like it's hard to always know like what the future could be. But there's definitely, at least from my experience, at this point, there's definitely a feeling that I get when I know I haven't gotten to the architecture that I should be doing at the moment. Like I haven't gotten to an adequate architecture, right? I definitely know that. And before, until like we started thinking about the concept of like, oh, I see, there's like these three different things. There's like the events buffer, there's the concept of like a static sort of naming of the different points of the debug, and then there's the UI hierarchies. And these things are like, you know, that's sort of the way that they're coming out. Until that locked into place, I was not getting that feeling of coalescing, right? It was just, everything was still kind of just a little bit like, I don't really know what exactly, I feel like something's a little wrong here. There's too much stuff that's not quite clear about what it should be doing. And so I like the fact that I feel like we've gotten past that now, and now it's just a question of like, okay, what's a passable implementation of that thing? Okay, so again, open data block. Open data block, close data block. These things are, I believe, the only real thing that we care about there is for doing like hierarchical listings of stuff, right? Like that was all those are really getting used for, if I'm not mistaken. Like you can see here, we just do like, okay, we open debug block, and that debug block like tells us who like the parent was for our stuff and all that thing, right? But I believe that if we have anything else, then like the rest of the stuff that we're getting is going to be sort of marked debug information, right? Am I right about that? Let me see what we're getting here. I guess at the moment, now that I think about it, we're really not even getting that, because at the moment, do we even, what's the actual, oops, I want to be in here. What's the actual set of things we actually get? So we get mark debug value. Does that come through every frame? Let me take a look. Mark debug value. So it doesn't. So it seems like it seems to me like we don't actually. Okay, so it looks to me, right, like we don't actually ever get the debug variable stuff here. Those never come through. Yeah, those never come through multiple frames. Those are strictly write only. Those are ones that basically come from the debug system to the program, and they never go back the other way. So its debug value is the only one that actually ever goes the other direction. And I just wanted to look and see, what does that come through as when we do a debug value? So it's an open close data block on the bracketing, and then, okay, and then it's just the type of the thing is just whatever the type of the data was that it was sending, right? So it's just going to come through as that. So in here, we are basically getting, that's basically a catch, oh, and it's not. So that's basically getting mark debug value is getting handled here, right? So here are ones that we handle specially, right? And then out here are the data, here's the data stuff that we receive that's actually just like feed forward data, right? And so the feed forward data, I guess, we don't have a whole lot of ways to hash that pointer-wise, do we? Or, well, you know, we probably actually do. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out what is the way to identify one of these uniquely. And I guess, you know, file name, line number, right? That sort of a thing we could certainly use. I'm trying to think if we have anything else when we use debug variable, debug value to output something, right? And it looks like, you know, when we do that, when we do record debug event here, I don't know that we ever actually put anything else in there that we could use. We don't create a static variable, which probably, you know, is for the best. I don't think we want to constantly be polluting everything with static variables. That it should be as write-only as possible in that sense. So I'm not sure what we want to do there. We could certainly create something a little bit more dramatic there. What I'm thinking is if you look at how debug value works, so let's just say, right? Let's say we were to do something where we uniqueified it by using the file line. We could use like file counter. Just file and counter would work, right? So picture this. Normally, in the other code, we could we had the ability to use the address as the hash thing, but in the case of the value, we don't have that option. But what we could do, right, pretty easily, is in this record debug event thing, we're passing the file name here, but instead we could pass something which was a little bit more descript. Right? Like we could do something that would be guaranteed to be unique. For example, file plus counter would always be unique. So you could imagine something that would be like this, right? ID or whatever, or unique that would be, for example, file, right? Like we could do something that would be guaranteed to be unique. For example, file plus counter would always be unique. So you could imagine something that would be like this, right? ID or whatever, or unique plus to be unique. For example, file plus counter would always be unique. So you could imagine something that would be like this, right? ID or whatever, or unique ID, GUID or something, right? Its GUID would be like, oh, whatever the file is as a string, and then you could imagine whatever a counter was, as a string. That would be an example. And of course, we'd have to do the sort of the stupid macro trick to get that into, usable format. But that would be a string value, and that string value would always be unique because there is no way to generate the same, the counter will never be the same value, and the file always uniqueifies it so that even if it was a different translation unit, it would be fine. I guess now I think about it, maybe if it was like an inline function that might break or something like this, but I feel like that's not something we would really care about too much, at least not that I can think about. So, and for that matter, if it wasn't an inline function, then the static value version wouldn't work either, because the address of that static variable is going to be the same, since the inline function presumably would get, would get the same static. I don't know, maybe not. So I could see doing that, which is something like, unique file counter string or something like this would just be like that sort of a thing. And again, we have to do that stupid non-counter, which would get the same static. I don't know, maybe not. So I could see doing that, which is something like, unique file counter string or something like this would just be like that sort of a thing. And again, we have to do that stupid nonsense that we do every time, which really is annoying. That we talked about before. And that would just be this. And so what we do is say, okay, we need the unique file counter string. Oops. There's unique file counter string. We take the file, and we take the counter, and we're done. And I think that would be sufficient. And then you'd have the GUID. And once you have the GUID, you also presumably don't need, if you don't want to, we could stop sending the file and line number just to reduce that traffic a little bit as well, right? We could do something like this if we wanted to, where we do file line counter. And if we did file line counter, then what we'd do is we'd say, all right, when we produce this string, now that we know that it's file line counter, we could do like, okay, we know that the string will have the file name in it, and now we want to basically create something that's going to be a readable, like a readable string. So it would be the file name, parentheses, the line number, right? And then maybe we just put a dot in there and then the counter, right? So it's like the nth one of these on that line. So in case someone stacked up more than one debug variable on the same line, it would still work in theory. I think that would work. Who knows? So if we did it that way, then everything would have a GUID in it. So we'd be fine from then on, and we don't need any of this stuff anymore. Like that stuff can just go away. Fine from then on, and we don't need any of this stuff anymore. Like that stuff can just go away. The block name, and we don't need any of this stuff anymore. Like that stuff can just go away. The block name, I suppose maybe we want to still keep just because we're using that for other things. But this way we don't actually take up any more space. In fact, we take up less space. And the GUID is actually the thing that also would allow us to, uniquify things. And so from then on, we could just use the event GUID, and that's what we'd use in the hash table, right? So in here, we would just do, like hash this event kind of a thing. But at this point, we're out of time. And so I'll leave things because I'm such a nice guy. I'll leave things in a building state by turning off Handmade internal for now. But leave things and so I'll just hash we'd use in the hash table, right? So in here, hash table, right? So in here we would, right? So in here we would just do, like hash this event kind of a thing. But at this point we're out of time, and so I'll leave things because I'm such a nice guy. I'll leave things in a building state by turning off Handmade internal for now, but we will undo that. So I'm going to go to a brief Q&A just beforehand. Yeah, I think we're in good shape. We just need a little more programming time, which is hard to come by in Handmade Hero because I only get an hour a night, which is not very much. So if you have any questions about what we're doing so far, go ahead and hit me up with those now. But keep in mind, I kind of have to do another hour tomorrow to kind of get everything sort of finished up with the hashing. But I think we're good otherwise. No questions. Elvin, for UI programming, what do you think of the model view controller pattern? So I guess what I would say is I think it's close to being the right way to look at UI things, or a right way, a good way, let's say, to look at UI things, but it's a little bit off. Like, I like to think of things UI-wise in terms of I have definitely the view part, right, of MVC. So there's a thing that's going to create, a sort of a rendering of some kind of whatever the stuff is that we're working with, right? And the model part makes some sense because, whatever that thing is that's producing the viewable, the view of things, it needs to have something that it's actually sort of, it needs to have some database, some structure that it's actually rendering out of. So we know we also have some kind of a backing model that we're editing. So the model and view part are pretty obviously reasonable ways of looking at things. The controller part, the thing that I have a little bit of a problem with in MVC is a lot of times when it's described, that part is not really expanded upon to the degree that I think it needs to be in order to actually have a functioning system. Like, controller is partially in the view and partially in some other code. Usually controller is really two things, one of which is usually welded to the view in a number of ways, right? And so it's really more like model, view manipulator, input processor is really the actual thing. And model view controller, it makes it seem like controller is actually separate from view entirely, but the truth is it's not, if that makes sense. So it's considering how old model view controller is, it's actually pretty darn good in terms of how it thinks about things. It's just you have to be careful about what you actually mean when you say it, because it's easy to potentially miss the important parts of it, I guess what I'd say. SSS McGrath. You can never have too many S's in McGrath. Could you talk a bit about other debug system-y stuff you've done before? I've done all sorts of debug systems, not much like what you're doing now, and I'm curious what other stuff you may have done. Just high-level description, one-sentence descriptions are fine. So I've done a lot of different debug system things before. They range from, they're all over the map. I don't know if I'm supposed to really talk about Mustache, which is the most recent one I did. And that was at Rad. That one is pretty baller. And so we'll let that one sit for a minute. I've done ones. So Granny had a pretty interesting one, and I think it eventually got removed after my tenure there. I'm not sure anyone even knew it was there besides me, but basically the way the debug system worked in Granny was pretty funny. The DLL itself had some debug infrastructure in it. And what it would do is you could actually make a call into the DLL and say, give me the root pointer back to the debug system. And then there was a tray application you could run that was like Granny debug view. And that tray application, it would look, and anytime the Granny DLL was running, it would call into it and it would get that debug information out of it. So you could, in the tray app, look at any running Granny applications that were there and go, show me all of the stuff that's in them, right? And that was kind of fun because it's just a nice way of being able to kind of have an outboard thing that inspects the debug information inside a running application as it's running. It was just kind of interesting. So that was a bit of a fun one. I've definitely done ones that are kind of like the way that I'm doing it now on the event side of things. There are ones that use streaming event models like that. But the others, the collation side of things doesn't. I've never done one that's does sort of the stuff that we're doing in there now. But I've done ones that do sort of that just writing it debug events to a log kind of a thing. And I'm kind of in the middle of one of those right now for our code base at Molly Rocket that hasn't quite reached maturity yet. And it's a little bit different because the way that it's meant to be one that works sort of in an expandable buffer way, and like it's kind of got different goals as to what it does. So that one's a little bit different than this one, and I'm not sure there's anything particularly relevant to say about it other than it's like it's meant to be a little more systems-y. It's meant to be a little more kernel log style kind of a thing than it is like this, which is meant for just dumping a bunch of sort of data into it or that sort of thing. And then Mustache is the one that has the most crazy stuff in it. That one has stuff that's like literally, it seems like magic when you actually, if you just use it, but then if you think about it, you're like, oh wait, no, right, that's not magic. You can just do that if you want. And that one does stuff that's like, oh, that one basically supports backtracey sorts of things, for lack of a better term. That one does stuff like, oh, here's a pixel on the screen, tell me like how it got there, right? And it's sort of like, you know, like Pix or one of those debugging systems that they have. Imagine having a system like that, but just for your general code base, right? And that's what it sort of did. Chris Zero, can you explain what the macro nastiness exactly does? Why do you have 2 underscore levels? We covered this a couple episodes ago, so you're going to want to go back and look at that. I gave a complete explanation. Basically, it's just because the preprocessor treats variables that are passed into it or that are intrinsic to it differently than variables that have been passed in more than once, right? So like every time you use a variable, just to give the capsule definition. So if I was to do this, that would not give me a string that was the line number. It would give me the string underscore underscore line underscore underscore, right? So the first time you pass it in, you're trying to pass it in so that you actually get it into a variable, right? The next time, but if I did it here, I would actually get the parameter b, like that comes through, I think. I can't remember exactly what it is. So you need to pass it in a second time in order to then turn it into an actual different variable than the actual word underscore underscore line. It's just C++ preprocessor ridiculousness. And I never remember the rules for this. I should go read them sometime and then just know. I never remember the rules for it, so it may be that you don't actually need another one, right? It's probably not necessary to have this one, but I never bother to actually remember exactly how the replacement rules work, so I just I usually put in